They thought they could buy my silence with a rehearsal dinner, sliding a contract across the linen to call me a gold digger. I'm Annette Carter, 31, a commercial title examiner. They didn't realize that before you strip a woman of her dignity, you should check who owns the dirt under your house. The Grand Oak Hearth was the kind of restaurant where the menus didn't have prices and the waiters spoke in hushed, reverent tones, as if they were delivering eulogies instead of medium-rare steaks. It was nestled in the rolling, affluent hills of Sewickley, Pennsylvania, a world away from the gritty, hard-working streets of Homestead where I had spent my childhood. Tonight, the private dining room was filled with 60 guests, almost all of them belonging to my fiancé Julian's social circle. There were country club board members, corporate lawyers, and old money matriarchs who wore their diamond tennis bracelets like armor. On my side of the long mahogany table sat exactly 3 people: my younger sister, Claire, and my 2 closest friends from the county recorder's office. We looked like a small, quiet island of polyester and off-the-rack department store dresses in a sea of custom-tailored silk and cashmere. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, feeling the heavy, cold weight of my grandmother's brass locket resting against my collarbone. It was a simple piece of jewelry, dented at the edges. But it was the most valuable thing I owned because of the love it represented. My father had spent 35 years working the night shift at the structural steel mill, and my mother had sewn draperies until her fingers were too arthritic to hold a needle. They had taught me that a person's worth wasn't measured by the brand of their car, but by the strength of their word. Julian sat next to me, his posture stiff, his eyes fixed firmly on his water glass. He hadn't looked at me in 20 minutes. Every time I reached out to touch his sleeve, he subtly shifted away, pretending to adjust his collar or reach for his bread roll. If you have ever sat in a crowded room and felt a sudden, icy draft realization that the person who promised to protect you is actually the one holding the door open for the wind, then you know the exact hollow sensation that settled in my chest. Some of you might be sitting at your own kitchen tables right now, remembering the exact moment you realized you were completely on your own. It is a quiet kind of pain. It doesn't scream. It just freezes you from the inside out. At the head of the table stood Genevieve Sinclair, my soon-to-be mother-in-law. She was a woman of 65 who wore her silver hair in a flawless, rigid bob that looked as though it could withstand a Category 5 hurricane. She cleared her throat, the sound sharp and metallic, cutting through the low murmur of polite conversation. The room fell instantly silent. 60 pairs of eyes turned toward her. "My friends, family, and distinguished colleagues," Genevieve began, her voice dripping with the practiced warmth of a seasoned charity gala host. "We are gathered here on the eve of my son's wedding. Julian has always been the pride of the Sinclair family. He carries a legacy of 3 generations of real estate development, philanthropy, and community leadership." She paused, her gaze drifting down the table until it landed squarely on me. Her eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of the affection she pretended to project. "When Julian chose Annette," she continued, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave, "we were surprised. We are a family of legacy. We build, we preserve, we protect what is ours. And in our world, marriage is not merely a romantic notion. It is a merger. It is a safeguarding of assets that took generations of hard, brilliant work to accumulate." I felt Claire's hand slip under the table, her fingers squeezing my knee. Her grip was tight, trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. I looked over at her and saw the fire in her eyes, but I also saw her helplessness. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmoneyed. Genevieve reached into her expensive leather handbag, which sat on the chair beside her, and pulled out a thick, white document bound in a heavy black folder. She didn't hand it to Julian. She didn't hand it to her lawyer, who was sitting 2 seats down, smiling like a vulture waiting for a carcass to stop twitching. Instead, she walked down the length of the table, her high heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. Click, click, click. Every step felt like a hammer hitting a nail. She stopped right behind me. She didn't place the document gently beside my plate. She slid it across the white linen tablecloth, knocking over my unused butter knife with a sharp clatter. "This is a prenuptial agreement," Genevieve said, her voice now carrying clearly to every corner of the silent room. "It has been drafted by our family's legal team. It ensures that in the event of a dissolution of this marriage, you leave with exactly what you entered with, which, according to our research, is a mountain of student loans, a 10-year-old sedan, and a salary that wouldn't cover the property taxes on our guest house." A few quiet snickers rippled through the right side of the table. Julian's sister, Cynthia, didn't even bother to hide her smirk behind her wine glass. "Mother," Julian muttered, his voice weak, devoid of any real protest. "We talked about this. Not now." "No, Julian," Genevieve interrupted, raising a perfectly manicured hand. "We do it now, publicly, because transparency is the foundation of trust. Annette, you have spent the last 2 years insinuating yourself into my son's life. You have enjoyed our dinners, our country club access, and the prestige of the Sinclair name." She leaned down, her face close enough to mine that I could smell her expensive French perfume, suffocating scent of roses and dry ash. "Sign it, gold digger," she whispered, though the silence in the room was so heavy that the words echoed off the timbered ceiling. "You bring absolutely nothing to this family. If you truly love my son and not his trust fund, you will put your signature on that dotted line right now, in front of everyone who matters." The humiliation was designed to be absolute. 60 people watched me. Some looked away out of a passing sense of decency, but most watched with a morbid, privileged curiosity, waiting to see if the girl from the steel town would cry, scream, or sign away her life just to keep her foot in the door of their golden palace. I looked down at the document. The title in bold, black lettering stared back at me. Asterisk prenuptial agreement and waiver of assets asterisk. I felt the hot sting of tears threatening to prick the corners of my eyes. I am a human being. I love Julian. Or at least I had loved the man I thought he was before his mother's shadow swallowed him whole. I felt the shame of being publicly branded an opportunist, a parasite, a nobody who had tried to climb too high. But then I looked at the signature page. I saw the legal jargon, the structured clauses, the standard boilerplate terms of asset division, and suddenly the tears didn't fall. As a commercial title examiner, my entire professional life is built on reading the fine print. I spend 40 hours a week in dusty municipal basements and digital databases, tracing property lines back to the 1800s, finding the hidden liens, the forgotten easements, and the fatal flaws in multi-million-dollar real estate deals that high-priced lawyers miss. I don't just read documents. I dissect them. I find the bones. I looked at Genevieve. I looked at Julian, who still couldn't meet my gaze. And then I looked at the heavy, faded blue linen folder that I had brought with me, tucked discreetly inside my own canvas tote bag on the floor. They thought I was empty-handed. They thought I was a charity case. They had no idea that the very ground they built their empire on was shifting beneath their feet. And I was the only one who had the map to the fault line. I slowly reached into my purse, my fingers wrapping around the cool, heavy metal of my grandfather's vintage fountain pen. I pulled it out, unscrewed the cap, and held it over the document. The room held its collective breath. Genevieve smiled, a triumphant, ugly curve of her lips. She thought she had won. She thought the quiet girl from Homestead had been broken. But I didn't press the nib of the pen to their paper. Instead, I laid the pen down on the table, leaned back in my chair, and reached down into my bag. If you've ever worked a job where you are essentially invisible, then you know what it's like to be treated as part of the furniture. In my line of work as a commercial title examiner, I spend my days in the basement of the Allegheny County Recorder of Deeds, breathing in the smell of disintegrating paper, vinegar-based microfilm, and old leather bindings. People in expensive suits walk right past me every day, carrying their leather briefcases and talking on their cell phones, never realizing that the quiet girl in the cardigan holds the keys to their entire kingdom. to understand why my hand didn't shake when I reached for that faded blue linen folder at the rehearsal dinner. You have to understand how I spent the 3 weeks leading up to that night. It started on a rainy Tuesday. I was sitting at my usual desk in the archives, the green fluorescent light of the microfilm reader casting a dull glow over my notepad. Marcus, the senior clerk who had worked in the archives since the late 80s, waddled over with a heavy, dust-covered ledger book. Marcus was a quiet man with ink-stained cuticles and a permanent smell of peppermint and stale coffee. He was the kind of friend who didn't say much, but he always knew when I needed a refill on my tea. "Annette," he had said, dropping the ledger onto my desk with a heavy, muffled thud that sent a puff of gray dust into the air. "You asked for the historical plat maps for the Sewickley Heights tract. It took some digging in the sub-basement. This one hasn't been opened since the Carter administration." "Thanks, Marcus," I said, rubbing my tired eyes. At the time, I wasn't looking for a weapon. I was just trying to do my job. Sinclair Holdings, the real estate development company owned by Julian's family, was in the final stages of securing a $42 million refinancing package for their flagship commercial project, the Monongahela Riverfront Landing. Because I was a title examiner, the senior underwriters at my firm had asked me to run a routine historical search on some of the collateral properties that Sinclair's had pledged to secure the loan. One of those collateral properties was the crown jewel of the Sinclair family empire, the 50-acre estate in Sewickley where Genevieve lived, and where Julian and I were supposed to build our future home. As I turned the yellowed, fragile pages of the 1954 tract book, my eyes caught a discrepancy. It was a tiny detail, the kind of thing a high-priced corporate lawyer would skim right over because they don't actually read the deeds. They pay people like me to do it. The legal description of the Sinclair estate claimed the property had been acquired in its entirety from the Ward Family Trust in 1954. But when I cross-referenced the grantor-grantee index, I noticed that only 3 of the 4 Ward heirs had signed the original deed of conveyance. The 4th heir, a sister named Beatrice Ward who had moved to Ohio, had never executed the deed. I paused, my heart doing a strange, sudden flutter in my chest. If Beatrice Ward had never signed, it meant she had never legally conveyed her 25% undivided interest in the land. And under Pennsylvania property law, that meant her heirs still owned a quarter of the very ground Genevieve Sinclair's sprawling mansion was built on. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay awake in my small apartment in Homestead, listening to the distant whistle of the trains moving through the valley. I kept thinking about the way Genevieve had looked at me during our first family dinner, her eyes scanning my off-the-brand purse with a mixture of pity and disgust. "We are a family of legacy, Annette." She had told me, her voice dripping with condescension. "We build on solid foundations." The next morning, I went back to the archives with a feverish intensity. I didn't tell Julian. I wanted to believe that this was just a clerical error, a simple mistake that could be easily resolved. But as I dug deeper, the truth became uglier, heavier, and far more deliberate. I tracked down the probate records of Beatrice Ward. She had passed away in 1974, leaving her estate to her only living descendant, a woman named Clara Ward, who is now 72 years old and living in a modest ranch home in Beaver Falls, surviving on a small pension. Clara had no idea that she was the legal owner of 12.5 acres of the most expensive real estate in western Pennsylvania. But the real shock came when I pulled the 1988 subdivision plat maps. In 1988, Julian's late father, Arthur Sinclair, had applied for a massive construction loan to build the Highland Estates subdivision surrounding their family home. To get that loan, the bank required an owner's affidavit, a legal document signed under penalty of perjury, swearing that there were no unrecorded claims, missing heirs, or clouds on the title. I found the microfilmed copy of that affidavit. Arthur Sinclair's signature was bold and arrogant at the bottom of the page. Right next to it was a notary stamp, and attached to the file was a private correspondence from their family attorney at the time. It was a memo, scanned by a lazy county clerk decades ago into a public utility easement file where it didn't belong. The memo explicitly warned Arthur Sinclair that the Ward family still held a legal claim to the land, and advised him to proceed with the subdivision quietly and hope that the statute of limitations or a quiet title action could be quietly settled later if anyone ever noticed. They had lied. They had committed bank fraud to build their empire. And they had done it while knowing that a working-class woman in Beaver Falls was being deprived of her rightful inheritance. Some of you might be thinking, asterisk, why didn't you just go to Julian? Asterisk, I did. Or at least, I tried to. 2 weeks before the rehearsal dinner, I sat with Julian in his pristine stainless steel kitchen. I had brought home a copy of the 1954 deed, intending to show him the missing signature, to tell him that his family's company was in serious legal jeopardy. I wanted us to fix it together, to do the right thing by Clara Ward. But before I could even open my bag, Julian had looked up from his iPad, his face tight with irritation. "Annette, please don't start with the work talk," he had said, his voice flat. "My mother is already stressed about the wedding invitations. She's embarrassed that your side of the guest list is so small. She thinks it looks bad to the board members." I had frozen, my hand still resting on the zipper of my bag. "Julian, I'm trying to tell you something important about your family's property. It's a legal matter." He had let out a short, mocking laugh. "A legal matter, Annette? You're a title examiner. You look at old paper for $30 an hour. Our lawyers make $500 an hour. Trust me, if there was a problem, the people who actually went to Ivy League law schools would have found it. Just leave the business to the people who know how to run it." The condescension in his voice was like a physical slap. It was the exact same tone his mother used when she asked if my father's friends from the mill would be wearing appropriate attire to the ceremony. That was the night the girl from Homestead, the girl who had watched her mother sew until her fingers bled just to buy her a prom dress, woke up. I realized that Julian didn't see me as his partner. He saw me as a quiet, grateful little mouse he had rescued from the working-class suburbs. Someone who would sit quietly at his table, look pretty in the photos, and never question where the money came from. So I didn't say another word. Instead, I went to work in silence. For the next 2 weeks, I spent my lunch hours and my evenings preparing my own folder. I didn't use my employer's resources. I didn't want to compromise my professional ethics. I went to the public library, using my own quarters to copy the certified deeds, the 1988 fraudulent affidavit, and the current title search report. I even drove out to Beaver Falls on a rainy Saturday. I sat in Clara Ward's small, neat living room, which smelled of cinnamon and old books. She was a lovely, gentle woman who showed me pictures of her grandchildren. When I explained the situation to her, showing her the deeds and the legal chain of title, her eyes had filled with tears. "My grandfather always said we owned part of that hill," she had whispered, her voice trembling. "But we never had the money to fight them. We didn't even know where to start." "You don't have to fight them, Clara," I had told her, reaching out to squeeze her frail hand. "I'm going to do it for you." I had Clara sign a formal representation agreement, appointing me as her designated title agent and attorney, in fact, to clear the cloud on her title. It was all perfectly legal, perfectly documented, and completely binding. I put all of those documents, the certified deeds, the fraudulent 1988 affidavit, Clara's representation agreement, and a formal title defect notice addressed to the Sinclair's primary lender, into a heavy, faded blue linen folder. I brought that folder to the rehearsal dinner, tucked inside my canvas tote bag, waiting for the right moment. I hoped I wouldn't have to use it. I hoped that somehow the Sinclairs would show a shred of decency, that Julian would stand up for me, that we could find a way to be a real family. But as I sat at that long mahogany table, listening to Genevieve call me a gold digger in front of 60 of her wealthiest friends, while Julian stared silently into his water glass, I knew the time for hope was over. They wanted a signature. They wanted to prove that I was nothing, that I brought nothing to their precious, fragile family. I looked at the thick, white prenuptial agreement sitting on the linen tablecloth in front of me. Then, I looked up at Genevieve, whose face was twisted into a smug, triumphant grin. Slowly, deliberately, I reached down and pulled the faded blue linen folder from my bag. If you've ever had to sit perfectly still while your entire world is being torn apart, you know that the hardest part isn't the pain, it's the silence. It's the way the air gets thick, like you're trying to breathe underwater, while everyone around you behaves as though nothing out of the ordinary is happening. I looked at the 60 guests seated around the mahogany tables of the grand oak hearth. I saw the expensive silk ties, the gold watches, catching the amber light of the chandeliers, and the polite, distant smiles of people who had never had to worry about how they would pay their heating bill in January. To them, this was just a minor hitch in a beautiful evening, a little family business being sorted out before the champagne was poured. They didn't see a young woman being stripped of her dignity. They saw a necessary transaction. I felt Julian's hand touch my elbow. It was the first time he had initiated physical contact in over an hour, but it wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was a nudge, a gentle, cowardly push. "Just sign it, Annette," he whispered, his voice so quiet it was almost lost beneath the hum of the air conditioning. "Let's just get through the dinner. We can talk about the details later. My mother just wants to make sure everything is structured correctly. You know how she is." I turned my head slowly to look at him. This was the man who, just 3 months ago, had stood with me on the porch of my small rented house in Homestead, holding my hands and telling me that he loved my independent spirit. He had told me that my background, the daughter of a steel worker and a seamstress, was what made me real. Now, looking into his pale blue eyes, I saw nothing but fear. He was terrified of his mother. He was terrified of losing his allowance, his position in the family firm, and the easy, cushioned life he had never had to work for. "Structured correctly," I repeated, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Exactly," Genevieve Sinclair said, her voice cutting through my conversation with her son like a razor blade. She had remained standing, her hands resting on the back of Julian's chair, looking down at me with the cold, satisfied expression of a general who had just accepted an unconditional surrender. "It's a standard legal instrument, Annette. Surely, with your background in clerical work, you understand the necessity of protecting established capital. We cannot allow sentimentality to override generational stewardship." I looked down at the white pages of the prenuptial agreement. Then I looked at the faded blue linen folder I had placed on the table right beside it. The contrast was striking. Their document was pristine, bound in heavy black leather-textured paper, smelling of fresh toner and corporate authority. Mine was slightly worn at the edges, a simple folder from the county archives, but it contained the weight of 70 years of buried truth. I didn't open my folder yet. Instead, I placed my hand flat on top of it, feeling the cool, textured paper beneath my palm. "Genevieve," I said, speaking clearly enough that the whispers at the neighboring tables began to die down. "You're absolutely right. Marriage is a merger. And in any business merger, the first and most critical step is due diligence. You wouldn't buy a company without thoroughly examining its assets, would you?" A brief, flickering shadow of confusion crossed Genevieve's face, but she quickly masked it with a patronizing smile. "Of course not. But in this case, the assets are entirely on our side. That is why we have drafted this agreement. To ensure that our family's holdings remain intact, and those holdings," I continued, my voice calm, conversational, "are detailed in Schedule A of this agreement, correct?" I turned the pages of the prenuptial agreement until I reached the back, where the schedule of Sinclair family assets was listed in neat columns of bold text. "Yes," the family lawyer, Richard Vance, spoke up. He was sitting 2 seats down, adjusting his silver silk tie with a manicured hand. He gave me a condescending nod, the kind of look a seasoned professor gives to a student who has asked a remarkably stupid question. Schedule A lists all real property, corporate shares, and trust funds currently held by Sinclair Holdings and its principals. It is a comprehensive and legally binding declaration. I see, I said. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, my fingers interlaced, and at the very top of this list under real property assets is the Soakley Heights estate, 50 acres of land, the primary residence, and the surrounding subdivision plots. Value estimated at $14 million. It's listed here as fully owned, unencumbered, and clear of any external claims. Naturally, Genevieve said, her tone growing impatient. She tapped her long, French manicured fingernail against the back of Julian's chair. Asterisk tap, tap, tap. Asterisk. That property has been in our family since my late husband's father purchased it in the 1950s. It is the very heart of our legacy. Now, Annette, we are running late for the main course. If you would, kindly sign the signature page. And the Monongahela Riverfront Landing, I interrupted, my voice remaining perfectly level. The commercial development project currently being used as collateral for your $42 million refinancing package with Mid-Atlantic Bank. That is also listed here as a primary asset of Sinclair Holdings. Richard Vance's eyes narrowed slightly. The smug, relaxed posture he had maintained all evening shifted. He sat up a little straighter, his gaze locking onto mine with a sudden, sharp intensity. Miss Carter, your professional background is in title examination, correct? I fail to see how your daily work with residential deeds has any bearing on the sophisticated commercial assets of the Sinclair family. Schedule A has been certified by our firm. It is legally sound. I let out a soft, slow breath. I looked at my sister, Claire, who was watching me from across the table. Her face was pale, her knuckles white as she gripped her water glass. But when she met my eyes, she gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. She knew. She was the only one in this room who knew how many hours I had spent under the flickering green light of the microfilm readers, tracing the lines of ink that these people thought had been erased by time and money. You know, Richard, I said, addressing the expensive lawyer by his first name, which caused his jaw to tighten. When you work in the county archives, you learn that people with money tend to make two very specific mistakes. First, they assume that because something is old, it is settled. And second, they assume that the people who earn $30 an hour to file their paperwork don't actually know how to read it. A quiet gasp rippled through the table. Cynthia, Julian's sister, set her wine glass down with a sharp click. Annette, that is enough, Julian muttered, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed red. He reached out to grab my wrist, but I subtly pulled my hand back out of his reach. You're making a scene. If you have an issue with the terms, we can discuss it privately with Richard tomorrow. Don't do this here. I'm not making a scene, Julian, I said, looking directly into his eyes. I'm performing due diligence. It's what your mother wanted, isn't it? Transparency. I slowly opened the faded blue linen folder. The first document inside was a certified copy of the 1954 deed for the Soakley Heights tract. The paper was heavy, a high-quality reproduction of the original hand-signed document, bearing the official gold seal of the Allegheny County Recorder of Deeds. I didn't throw it. I didn't slide it aggressively. I simply placed it gently in the center of the white tablecloth, right over the silver butter knife that Genevieve had knocked over earlier. This is a certified copy of the original deed of conveyance for the Sinclair estate, dated October 12, 1954, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent dining room. The grantor is listed as the Ward Family Trust. The grantees are Arthur and Beatrice Sinclair. But if you look at the bottom of the signature page, you'll notice something very interesting. I pointed a calm, steady finger at the bottom of the document. The Ward Family Trust was held jointly by 4 siblings. Under Pennsylvania law in 1954, any conveyance of trust property required the unanimous signature of all named beneficiaries to be legally valid. But there are only 3 signatures on this deed. Beatrice Ward, who held a 25% undivided interest in the land, never signed this document. She was living in Ohio at the time, and due to a family dispute, she refused to participate in the sale. The room was so quiet now that I could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the lobby of the restaurant. Richard Vance leaned forward, his face suddenly pale, his hand reaching out to pull the certified deed toward him. He adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the signature page with a frantic, professional intensity that he couldn't hide. This is an old conveyance," Vance stammered, his voice losing its smooth, practiced cadence. "Even if there was a missing signature, the statute of limitations." Adverse possession. Adverse possession requires open, notorious, and hostile use of the land without the permission of the true owner, I said, reciting the legal statute as easily as if I were reading a grocery list. But because Beatrice Ward was a co-tenant, her possession was legally considered permissive, not hostile, until an active ouster occurred. And there has never been an ouster. In fact, Beatrice Ward's sole legal heir, Clara Ward of Beaver Falls, has been paying her portion of the county land taxes on an unsubdivided parcel of that tract for 30 years. I have the tax receipts right here. I reached into my folder and pulled out a neat stack of certified tax documents, placing them gently on top of the deed. Genevieve Sinclair's rigid, perfect posture seemed to freeze. Her face, which had been flushed with triumphant arrogance just moments before, began to pale. She looked at Richard Vance, her eyes wide with a sudden, silent demand for reassurance. "Richard," she whispered, her voice sharp and brittle. "What is she talking about? Tell her she's wrong." But Richard Vance didn't answer her. His eyes were glued to the tax receipts, his fingers trembling slightly as he turned the pages. He was a corporate lawyer who made $500 an hour, but in this moment, he was staring at a flaw in his client's empire that had been uncovered by a woman who earned her living in the dusty basement of a county building. I looked at Genevieve, and for the first time, I saw the first cracks of real, raw panic beginning to show beneath her expensive makeup. Richard Vance's hands were actually shaking. For a man who charged $500 an hour to make problems disappear, he looked remarkably like a schoolboy who had just been caught stealing from the teacher's desk. He picked up the certified 1954 deed, his eyes darting back and forth across the signature lines, then snatched the tax receipts. He began flipping through them so fast, the paper made a dry, frantic clicking sound in the silent room. "This can't be," Vance muttered, his voice barely a whisper, though in that quiet room, it carried like a bell. "The Ward family. We did a title search during the '88 subdivision. The title insurance policy cleared it." "No, Richard," I said, my voice steady, carrying the calm authority of someone who had spent 10 years finding the bodies buried in the county archives. "Your title insurance company accepted an owner's affidavit. They took Arthur Sinclair's word for it. Because when you're a Sinclair, people don't check the basement files. They just take your signature and cash your premium check." I reached back into my faded blue folder. I could feel 60 pairs of eyes locked onto my hands. The amusement, the polite boredom, the smug superiority that had filled the grand oak hearth just 10 minutes ago had completely evaporated. The wealthy guests at the surrounding tables were leaning forward, their forks suspended in mid-air, their expensive dinners growing cold on their plates. "And that brings us to the second document," I said, pulling out a crisp, white piece of paper. "This is a copy of the owner's affidavit signed by Julian's father, Arthur Sinclair, on September 14, 1988, to secure the construction loan for the Highland Estates subdivision. Under penalty of perjury, Arthur swore that there were no outstanding claims, no unrecorded heirs, and no clouds on the title of the Soakley Heights tract." I looked directly at Genevieve. Her perfect silver bob seemed to stiffen, her face so pale that her expensive blush looked like 2 pink bruises on her cheeks. "But Arthur knew," I continued, my voice dropping to a quiet, heavy tone. "And you knew too, Genevieve. Because in the very same county file, misfiled under a public utility easement, I found a letter from your own legal counsel at the time. It was a private memo warning Arthur that Beatrice Ward's heirs still held a 25% undivided interest in the land, and advising him to proceed quietly because the family couldn't afford to delay the subdivision construction. You lied to the bank to get a $12 million loan. That isn't just a title defect, Genevieve. That is bank fraud. A collective, sharp intake of breath echoed through the room. Julian's sister, Cynthia, actually let out a small, terrified squeak and dropped her silver spoon. It hit her porcelain bowl with a loud, ringing **ping** that made everyone flinch. Julian himself looked as though he had been carved out of cheap soap. He sat frozen, his eyes wide and vacant, his mouth slightly open. He looked at the document in my hand, then at his mother, and finally, for the first time in an hour, he looked at me. But I didn't see the man I had loved. I saw a stranger who had been built on a foundation of stolen dirt. Have you ever watched a bully realize in one single second that the person they've been kicking is the only one who can save them? If you have, then you know the exact expression that came over Genevieve Sinclair's face. It is a terrible, ugly transition. The mask of generational nobility slips, and underneath is just raw, naked panic. Annette, Genevieve said, her voice cracking, losing its smooth charity gala warmth. She took a step toward me, her hand reaching out as if to block the view of the guests. Annette, please. We are family. This is a highly technical, private business matter. There is no need to discuss such things in front of our guests. Let's put these papers away and go into the private study. We aren't family yet, Genevieve, I said, my hand resting firmly on the edge of the blue folder. 10 minutes ago, you stood in front of these 60 people and told me that I brought nothing to this family. You called me a gold digger. You wanted to make sure that everyone who matters saw me get on my knees and sign away my dignity just to have a seat at your table. I stood up. I didn't do it quickly or aggressively. I just stood up, straight and tall, feeling the cool weight of my grandfather's brass locket against my chest. I looked out at the room of wealthy, powerful people who had watched my humiliation with such detached curiosity. I grew up in Homestead, I said, my voice echoing off the high timbered ceiling. My father worked the night shift at the steel mill until his lungs were full of dust. My mother ruined her eyes sewing curtains for families like yours so she could buy me my first typewriter. They taught me that the only thing you take to your grave is your name and your honesty. I might not have a trust fund, and I might drive a 10-year-old sedan, but every single dollar I have ever earned was clean. I can't say the same for the roof over your head, Genevieve. Annette, stop. Julian finally found his voice, though it was weak and desperate. He stood up beside me, his hands reaching for my shoulders. You're destroying my family? You're destroying everything we've built. I'm not destroying anything, Julian, I said, looking at him with a pity that hurt worse than anger. Your grandfather and your father built this house on a lie. I'm just the one who found the receipt. I turned my attention back to Richard Vance, who had taken off his glasses and was wiping his brow with a silk pocket square. As you know, Richard, I said, Sinclair Holdings is currently in the final stages of securing a $42 million refinancing package with Mid-Atlantic Bank for the Monongahela Riverfront Landing. The primary collateral for that loan is the Soakley Heights estate. But Mid-Atlantic Bank has a very strict title clearance policy. They do not accept unmitigated clouds on title, especially when those clouds involve potential historical fraud. I pulled the final document from my blue folder. It was a single sheet of paper, pre-addressed to the Commercial Loan Underwriting Department of Mid-Atlantic Bank. It was a formal title defect notice, drafted in perfect legal terminology, detailing the 25% outstanding interest held by Clara Ward and the fraudulent 1988 affidavit. This is a title defect notice, I said, placing it on top of the pile. As Clara Ward's designated attorney, in fact, I have the legal authority and the professional obligation to file this notice with the county recorder and the primary lender. Once this is recorded tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, Mid-Atlantic Bank will freeze the refinancing package. The $42 million will be held in escrow indefinitely. And without that funding, Sinclair Holdings will default on its construction bonds for the riverfront project by the end of the month. Richard Vance looked as if he might throw up. He knew the math. He knew that a default of that size would trigger a domino effect, collapsing their commercial development projects, freezing their credit lines, and likely exposing the estate to a massive quiet title lawsuit that they would lose. "My God, Genevieve," Vance whispered, his face completely bloodless. "She's right. If she files this, the bank pulls the funding. It's over." Genevieve Sinclair didn't look at the lawyer. She stared at me, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. The absolute certainty of her world. The world where money bought silence, where working-class girls were disposable, where the law was something you hired people to bend, had just shattered on the white linen tablecloth of the grand oak hearth. She looked at the prenuptial agreement that she had slid across the table to humiliate me. It lay there, a useless stack of paper, completely stripped of its power. Then she did something I never thought I would see. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched the edge of my faded blue folder. Her fingers, usually so steady and elegant, were shaking so violently that her diamond rings clicked against the wood of the table. "What do you want, Annette?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the low, shocked murmurs of the 60 guests who were now witnessing the quiet execution of the Sinclair empire. I looked at her, and for a brief moment, I felt the heavy, sorrowful sigh of my mother in my heart. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel a rush of cheap, angry pleasure. I just felt a deep, profound peace. I had done my job. I had protected the truth. "I want what is fair, Genevieve," I said, my voice quiet but perfectly clear. "And we are going to start by rewriting the terms of this merger." Slowly sank back into her chair, her eyes never leaving mine, as the 60 guests watched the silent shift of power from the matriarch of Sewickley to the girl from Homestead. The silence that followed my words was not the polite, hushed quiet of the grand oak hearth. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a courtroom right after a verdict is read. I didn't wait for Genevieve to find her voice, nor did I wait for Julian to conjure up some half-hearted apology. I slowly reached down, picked up my grandfather's vintage fountain pen, and slid it back into my purse. Then, with deliberate care, I took off the diamond engagement ring that had felt so heavy on my finger for the past 3 months. I didn't throw it. I didn't slide it across the table. I simply set it down right in the center of the unsigned prenuptial agreement, directly over the line where my signature was supposed to go. "I think we're done here," I said softly. I looked at Claire, who was already standing, her chin held high, a proud, fierce smile breaking through the tension on her face. My 2 friends from the recorder's office stood up with her, forming a quiet, solid wall of support at my back. I turned my back on the 60 stunned guests, on the silver-plated chafing dishes, and on the family that had tried to make me feel small. As we walked out of the private dining room, the only sound was the rhythmic click of my modest heels against the hardwood floor. It was the sound of a woman walking away from a trap she had built herself by believing in a man who wasn't strong enough to stand beside her. Outside, the cool Pennsylvania night air hit my face, smelling of damp earth and incoming rain. It felt incredibly clean. I know some of you reading this might have wanted me to file that title defect notice the very next morning at 9 o'clock sharp. You might have wanted to see the Sinclair empire crumble into bankruptcy court, to see the bank pull the $42 million, and to watch Genevieve's mansion go up on the auction block. I understand that feeling. When you've been treated like dirt by people who think their wealth makes them untouchable, the urge to tear down their high walls is incredibly strong. But my father didn't raise me to be destructive. He raised me to be fair. And more importantly, I had a responsibility to Clara Ward. At 8:30 the next morning, my phone began to ring. It was Richard Vance. The arrogant, condescending tone from the night before was completely gone, replaced by the frantic, sweat-slicked urgency of a corporate lawyer trying to stop a bullet that had already left the barrel. "Annette," he said, his voice cracking slightly through the speaker. "We need to talk before the recorder's office opens. We can resolve this. We can resolve this today." "I'm listening, Richard," I said, sitting at my small kitchen table in Homestead, a warm mug of black tea between my hands. "But you're not talking to Annette, the fiancée, anymore. You're talking to the designated attorney in fact for Clara Ward, and my loyalty is to my client." The negotiations took 3 days. They were held in a neutral conference room at a title insurance office downtown, not in the Sinclairs' mahogany-lined boardroom. Genevieve didn't show up to those meetings. She couldn't bear to look at the girl from the steel town who had held the pen that could rewrite her family's destiny. Instead, she sent Vance with a power of attorney and a blank checkbook. The financial mechanism of their survival was simple, but incredibly costly to them. To clear the cloud on the title and secure the $42 million refinancing package from Mid-Atlantic Bank, Sinclair Holdings had to execute a formal partition and settlement agreement. They had to purchase Clara Ward's 25% undivided interest in the Soakley Heights tract at its current certified market value. We didn't let them use their own appraisers. I insisted on an independent, court-approved valuation of the 50-acre estate and the surrounding subdivision plots. The final number was $3,800,000. When the settlement papers were ready, I drove back out to Beaver Falls. I sat with Clara Ward at her worn kitchen table, the very table where she had shown me her grandfather's old letters. When I explained that Sinclair Holdings had agreed to wire the full $3.8 million into a trust fund for her and her grandchildren, she wept. She reached out and held my hands, her fingers trembling with a mixture of shock and profound relief. "I don't know how to thank you, Annette," she whispered, wiping a tear from her cheek. "We've lived on the edge for so long. This changes everything for my family." "You don't have to thank me, Clara," I said, feeling a warm, deep ache of satisfaction in my chest. "Your grandfather owned that land. You just got what was always yours." As Clara's designated representative, my firm received a standard title clearance commission, a fraction of the settlement, but more than enough to completely wipe out my student loans and leave me with a comfortable nest egg. For the first time in my 31 years, I didn't have to do the survival math at my kitchen table on Sunday nights. Julian tried to call me 3 weeks after the settlement was finalized. I let the phone ring. When he sent a long, rambling email apologizing for his mother's behavior, claiming he had been caught in the middle and wanted to try again, I read it calmly. I felt a faint, lingering pang of sadness for the dream I had built in my head, but no anger. I agreed to meet him one last time, not at an expensive restaurant in Soakley, but at a small, noisy diner near the Homestead High Bridge. The air inside smelled of grease, maple syrup, and cheap coffee. Julian sat across from me in his custom-tailored suit, looking incredibly out of place against the cracked vinyl of the booth. He looked tired. The easy, unbothered confidence that had drawn me to him was gone, replaced by a hollow, nervous energy. "My mother is. She's different now, Annette," he said, staring down at his thick ceramic mug of coffee. "The board of Sinclair Holdings forced her to step down as managing partner. They couldn't risk the publicity if the 1988 affidavit ever became public. She spends all her time in the gardens now. She doesn't really talk to anyone." "I'm sorry to hear that, Julian," I said, and I meant it. I had never wanted to destroy Genevieve. I had only wanted her to stop trying to destroy me. She actually told me to tell you something," Julian said, his voice dropping. He looked up at me, his pale blue eyes searching my face. "She said you were the only person who ever looked at the Sinclair name and wasn't afraid of it. She said she respects that in her own way." I gave him a small, lukewarm smile. "Thank you for telling me, Julian. Is there any chance for us, Annette?" he asked, reaching across the table, his hand open, waiting. "Now that the business is sorted out? Now that we don't have to worry about the money or the prenups?" I looked at his hand, then up at his face. I saw a boy who had grown up in a golden cage, a boy who would always look to his mother or his money to tell him who he was. If you have ever had to say goodbye to someone you still have a soft spot for, simply because you know they don't have the courage to love you the way you deserve, then you know how heavy that moment is. "No, Julian," I said gently, keeping my hands resting in my own lap. "You didn't stand up for me when I was sitting at your table. You only wanted me back after you realized I was the one holding the keys. That isn't love. That's just a recalculation of assets." I stood up, laid a $5 bill on the table to cover my tea, and walked out into the gray, familiar streets of my hometown. A year has passed since that rainy night at the Grand Oak Hearth. I still work as a title examiner, but I don't work in the dusty basement of the county building anymore. With the commission from Clara Ward's settlement, I opened my own independent title consulting firm. I have a small, bright office on the main street of Homestead, with a big window that lets in the morning sun and a thriving business helping local families protect their homes from unfair developers and predatory lenders. Claire works with me now, greeting clients with her bright, fierce smile, and Marcus still stops by on his lunch break to bring me peppermint candies and gossip from the county archives. Yesterday, I bought a small, sturdy craftsman house with a deep front porch and a yard full of wild hydrangeas. It isn't a 50-acre estate in Sewickley, and there are no country club board members living on my street. But the foundation is solid, the roof doesn't leak, and every single inch of the dirt beneath it belongs to me. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I sit on my porch with a cup of tea, watching the fireflies rise over the valley. I look at my grandmother's brass locket, still resting against my collarbone, and I think about the lessons my parents taught me at our old, worn kitchen table. If you are sitting at your own table tonight, feeling the cold weight of someone else's low expectations, I want you to remember something. The people who think they can buy your silence or trade your dignity for a signature are only as strong as the paper they print their contracts on. They build their empires on high hills, but they forget that the hills are made of earth, and the earth has a way of holding on to the truth. Keep your eyes open. Read the fine print, and never, ever let anyone make you believe that you bring nothing to the table. Because in the end, love, dignity, and a clean name are things that no trust fund can ever buy. They are gifts, not line items in a budget. And once you realize you already own them, you realize you have always been the wealthiest person in the room.